Picture this. You are a young noblewoman in 3rd century Rome, raised behind marble walls, certain that family status protects you from the darker parts of imperial life. Your father is wealthy, your name is respected, and you believe nothing can touch you. Then one afternoon, a messenger arrives carrying a sealed imperial summons from Empress Julia Soaemias Bassiana. You assume it is an invitation to a banquet or a philosophical gathering meant for Rome's elite women. But the moment you step inside the palace, you learn the truth. This was never an invitation. It was a command. You are not a guest. You are a participant in a ritual of humiliation carefully staged for the private pleasure of the imperial court. These events were not rumors whispered in dark corners. They are recorded by official historians like Cassius Dio and Herodian, who witnessed the empire during this exact reign. They describe noblewomen, senators' daughters, generals' wives, forced to compete in public sexual displays of devotion under imperial supervision. What looked like culture on the surface was actually a weapon of control, and this was not a one-time scandal. It was a system. The empire kept records, rankings, and written reports of who submitted and who resisted. Archaeological excavations on the Palatine Hill have uncovered chambers and seating layouts designed for these private spectacles, matching the descriptions preserved in Roman histories. Hundreds of aristocratic families were trapped inside this machine for nearly 3 years. Refusal meant exile, financial destruction, or quiet disappearance. Submission meant survival. The entire aristocratic hierarchy was reshaped by this exploitation, because if you refused, you were no longer considered part of Rome's loyal nobility. And if you think this already sounds nightmarish, stay with me, because it gets far darker than anything taught in normal Roman history. We haven't even reached the part where the empress turned humiliation into politics and into profit. The manipulation always began with a lie. Every noblewoman received an elegant summons wrapped in the language of culture and virtue, inviting her to a philosophical symposium on feminine devotion. It sounded harmless, even flattering, as if the empress was honoring their status. But once these women stepped through the palace doors, the mask fell. They were not taken to a banquet hall or a lecture chamber. They were escorted to a hidden amphitheater, a private arena designed for humiliation, not celebration. The space was arranged like a courtroom, with the imperial household seated above and the women placed below, not as guests, but as subjects of judgment. Everything about this was deliberate and calculated. There were written lists of participants, clerks taking notes, and officials responsible for organizing each performance. The empire treated it like a public office. Rewards were given to the so-called favorites who complied quickly, while quiet punishments followed those who hesitated. Families that cooperated were given tax relief, business privileges, and invitations to higher imperial circles. Families that resisted lost contracts, saw their husbands stripped of honors, or found their estates suddenly questioned by imperial auditors. It was not chaos, it was administration, humiliation enforced through paperwork. One recorded case makes the consequences painfully clear. A senator's wife refused to appear for her summons, believing her family name would protect her. Within a week, her husband's public offices were revoked, their trade shipments were blocked, and their creditors were encouraged to move against them. She did not bend because she believed in the ritual. She bent because refusal meant collapse. The message spread quickly among the aristocracy. The empire was not asking for loyalty, it was demanding submission. And submission required silence, shame, and obedience. What began as a secret court ritual in Rome soon grew into something far larger. After the first year, the empress ordered the same system to be copied in other major cities loyal to the imperial dynasty. Alexandria built its own private theater. Antioch followed next. Then Carthage. What was once a disturbing rumor became state practice. And because it was presented as imperial custom, people stopped asking whether it was moral. They only asked how to survive it. Court duty was no longer about speeches, charity, or cultural refinement. It became a test of obedience measured through humiliation. Young noblewomen quickly learned that attendance was not optional, and participation was considered proof of loyalty to the throne. Over time, compliance turned into routine. Families that once whispered in fear began preparing their daughters in advance, teaching them how to endure what was waiting for them when the summons came. Mothers who had suffered became silent instructors. The message was cruel but simple. Dignity could be sacrificed, but family survival could not. The psychological toll was enormous. Contemporary writers describe a wave of despair rising among highborn households. Unexplained illnesses, long periods of seclusion, and suicides that were quietly dismissed as domestic tragedy. Life at the top of Roman society had become a cage lined with gold. You were privileged enough to stand close to the throne, which meant you were close enough to be controlled by it. In time, humiliation even became a political qualification. A woman who did not participate could not gain favor. A family that resisted could not rise in the Senate. Imperial loyalty was measured not by service to Rome, but by a willingness to endure disgrace in front of the Empress. The system no longer needed force. It had built its own momentum. Fear did the rest. Once the system was fully established, humiliation became more than entertainment. It became a political weapon. The Empress kept detailed records of every woman who participated, who hesitated, and who resisted. These documents were used like chains. A noble family could be controlled without guards or prisons. All the Empress needed was the threat of exposure. Powerful men stayed silent, not because they supported the system, but because their wives, daughters, or sisters were already trapped inside it. Blackmail created loyalty where respect no longer existed. Any attempt to challenge the Empress was crushed before it began. Senators who protested lost their estates. Governors who questioned the practice were removed from office. Some simply vanished after routine travel. The empire no longer feared rebellion because every potential rebel carried a secret that could destroy their household. Victims unwillingly became tools of enforcement. To protect themselves, they protected the system that harmed them. That is how corruption becomes self-sustaining. It forces the wounded to defend the wound. But the moment the Empress tried to extend this humiliation to foreign royal families, everything changed. Allied kingdoms refused to sacrifice their daughters. Marriage deals were cancelled. Diplomatic ties froze. Rome, once feared for its legions, became whispered about for its scandals. Foreign rulers no longer saw the imperial court as civilized. They saw it as diseased. This was the breaking point. The empire was no longer feared or respected, only pitied and despised. When the backlash finally reached Rome itself, the fall was sudden and violent. A coalition of senators, court officials, and members of the Praetorian Guard moved against the Empress. In a single day, both she and her son were killed, and the entire network of enforced humiliation collapsed with them. What brought down an imperial dynasty was not war, invasion, or famine. It was the shame that the empire had turned into law. When we look back at this part of Roman history, it becomes clear that the ugliest forms of power do not always appear as violence in the open. Sometimes they hide behind ceremony, respectability, and paperwork. The empire did not need chains or prisons. It used humiliation, fear, and silence instead. And if this story feels distant, it should not. The pattern still exists today, just in different clothing. Whenever shame is turned into a tool of control, whenever people are forced into obedience through fear of exposure, the same structure is repeating itself. Bureaucracy becomes the mask of abuse, and the victims are erased from memory while the abuser's name is preserved in the record. The most tragic part of this story is that we do not know the names of most of the women who suffered. We know the Empress, we know the Emperor, and we know the historians, but the people who paid the price were buried in silence. History remembers the throne, not the broken lives beneath it. That is why these stories must be told, not to sensationalize the past, but to give voice to those who never received justice. So I want to hear your thoughts. What other parts of history do you think were sanitized or deliberately softened? What patterns from this empire do you see echoed in our world today? Share in the comments and let us keep this conversation honest and respectful to the victims who were forgotten. If you value this kind of historical investigation, the kind that exposes what official records tried to bury, consider subscribing. Your support helps bring more of these hidden stories to light. Because in the end, power corrupts, but when it no longer fears consequences, it breeds monsters. If this story opened your eyes to the darker side of Rome, then make sure you like the video, share it forward, and subscribe so more buried truths come to light.